Hello, everybody, and welcome back to my podcast. Today, I would like to go over the history of football in St. Louis to try to prove that St. Louis is a sports town in spite of what a certain NFL owner said we aren't. I will prove this by using football teams that have come to this city as well as the loyal, loud, and raucous fans that cheer them on every game. In my opinion, sports are at the center of St. Louis. Considering that the stadiums are in the center of downtown St. Louis, and to the people of St. Louis that go to every game with the same passion and fire every time. Football is one of the many sports that has been hosted in St. Louis for many years and the three teams to officially call St. Louis home. The three teams are the Cardinals, the Rams, and most recently, the Battlehawks of the revamped XFL. These teams have been greeted with a fantastic and very loyal fans that a certain owner doesn't believe that to be true. I hope you enjoy your journey through football in St. Louis. For the first part of this podcast, we're going to go over the St. Louis Rams' tenure and departure from St. Louis, which is just a summary of the years they were here in St. Louis, the departure that led them to Los Angeles, the hatred for Stan Kroenke in St. Louis, and the legal cases that come from it. The Rams played in St. Louis from 1995 to 2015. During that tenure, they achieved one league championship in 1999, one Super Bowl championship in 1999, Super Bowl 34, two conference championships in the NFC in 1999 and 2001, three division championships in the NFC West in 1999, 2001, and 2003. They had four winning seasons in 1999, 2000, 2001, and 2003. The rest were below 500. Their worst record was in 2009 of 1-15, and their best record was in 2001 at 14-2. The fallout for the Rams in St. Louis were the failed proposals for the new stadium debacle that took place in the years prior to the departure. The departure for the St. Louis Rams was finalized in 2015 when Stan Kroenke filed for relocation to the NFL and was granted relocation by the rest of the NFL owners. Get in the hatred of Stan Kroenke. Wherever you go in St. Louis, you always hear how much a St. Louis sports fan hates Stan Kroenke and his name. And I do too. Anywhere you go, like a Blues game versus the Avalanche, or just in any mention of the name Kroenke, it's usually followed by sucks or some other expletives. Once the Rams left St. Louis, they had moved to Los Angeles, but they were still involved in legal cases in St. Louis. The four cases were a lawsuit involving future ownership of the Rams' former practice facility in Earth City, known as Rams Park. A second involves fans who bought tickets and team merchandise in the final years of the Rams' time in St. Louis. A third is a class action suit on behalf of thousands of PSL, personal seat license holders, from the team's 21-season stay in St. Louis. The fourth and the biggest of the four basically changes the way the Rams, the NFL, and the 31 other NFL teams went about the process of relocating the Rams from St. Louis to Los Angeles. Football was still involved in St. Louis even when it wasn't even there. The St. Louis Stallions were an NFL expansion team trying to be put in after the Cardinals left, and so St. Louis put their name in for an expansion team in 1991 called the St. Louis Stallions. The Stallions were never picked up and lost out on rights as the expansion team to the Carolina Panthers and the Jacksonville Jaguars. There was another chance for football in St. Louis in the Alliance of American Football. The team was never named. 2019, a new league started up called the AAF, or the Alliance of American Football, which later filed for bankruptcy in their first season. St. Louis was slated for a team, except they were not able to host the stadium for home games due to concerts and other events taking place at the Dome during those scheduled games, so the team was never started. Football was back in St. Louis in 2020. The St. Louis Battlehawks of the XFL. During the two home games in the shortened inaugural season, the Battlehawks bolstered the highest attendance in one game in the home opener versus the Guardians, and the third highest attendance versus the Dragons the following week. Many people related to the XFL commented on how loud the stadium was over the broadcast, and the recaps on XFL's social media did not fail to mention the raucous fans. These fans were also featured in articles in the Riverfront Times, Fox 2, the Alton Telegraph, and others. I was gracious enough to be at the Battlehawks home opener and part of the raucous crowd that made the headlines of local newspapers. Kroenke sucks chants were flying all across the stadium. Many posters of Kroenke sucks and other similar sentiment towards Stan Kroenke as well as some cacaws and Battlehawks calls going side to side. The rally towels also made massive contributions, and I think the players feasted off the energy with their most convincing win of the shortened season. The Battlehawks in their shortened inaugural season also made a big impact in St. Louis outside of the games. Local companies were able to feast off the success of the Battlehawks merchandise like Arch Apparel, Zoe's Attic, Busy Bee Boutique, and STL Style. Most of the merch was related to the Battlehawks name or the cacaw, and even the famous victory seltzer that the winning XFL team would celebrate after the game, the Bud Light Seltzer. Archer Panel sold around 3,000 pieces of Battlehawks merchandise since it has been released, and the fans of St. Louis did it to spite Stan Kroenke and show the love of football that I think and many others think is here in St. Louis. Okay, for my first interview, I'm going to interview my brother, my younger brother. Nick, the first question is, do you like sports?
I do like sports, yep.
Which sports do you like?
I like basketball, lacrosse, soccer, baseball, football.
Do you go to professional games like the Cardinals, Blues, or Battlehawks?
I do. I did not make it to a Battlehawks game, but I'm hoping to make it to one soon.
If you don't go, do you try to watch those games on television?
I do in my free time, but free time isn't always a gift, so it's a struggle to watch them.
Do you think that St. Louis is a sports town?
Yeah, to an extent. I think St. Louis has built a culture around sports with the Cardinals, Blues, and Battlehawks, and it's like a brotherhood between those three that you don't see in other cities.
Mm-hmm. What are your thoughts on Stan Kroenke saying St. Louis isn't a sports town and saying it's a baseball town? Do you agree?
I disagree with that. I mean, you see the partying that happened after the Blues won the Stanley Cup. Like, the town went crazy for at least a week, and when the Battlehawks win every Sunday, it's a party. So I think it's definitely a false statement, although a lot of the culture comes from baseball.
What were your thoughts on the departure of the Rams?
I was initially sad because I'd liked watching the Rams. It was nice to have a pro football team here, watch all the best players when they came to town, but I mean, it was like a team to root for, but when they left, I wasn't like completely disheartened by it. It was just one less thing that I had to think about on Sunday mornings.
What were your thoughts about the Battlehawks bringing professional football back to St. Louis?
Initially, I was skeptical. I thought it was kind of a fake league at first, and it was just going to be like a league that lasted for 1 week as it previously did, but it stayed around for as long as it could, and I got a lot of hype around it, so it kind of caught my attention to it. So I would start watching it if the hype continued to be at the level it was before it had to leave.
And for the final question, you kind of already answered this, but what are some examples of how you see St. Louis as a sports town in your own eyes?
Oh, I mean, Blues winning the Stanley Cup, obviously. That was a huge one. One more vivid memory was 2011 World Series.
Mm-hmm.
Me and my brother were at Game 6, and just walking down the stairs, the tunnel to the stairs was just crazy. Everyone was hugging each other and patting each other on the back. Like, it was insane. Really indescribable, and the brotherhood behind it was just insane.
Mm-hmm.
It's crazy.
Thank you for your time, Nick. That's all.
Yeah, no problem.
For my second interview, I'm here with my dad. Dad, do you like sports?
I love sports.
Which sports would you say you love the most?
Well, I would say I probably now love basketball the most because you and your brother played that longer. But it used to always be football first. And then I would have said baseball second, and then basketball third.
Do you go to professional games like the Cardinals, the Blues, or the Battlehawks?
I don't go to as many Blues games, and we should remedy that. But yes, go to a lot of Cardinals games, probably a half dozen a year. And we went to the first Battlehawks home game.
Mm-hmm. If you're not able to make it to those games, do you watch those games on television?
Definitely watch some Blues games, not as many as I should. I'm becoming a hockey fan. But watch a lot of football, watch a lot of basketball, and watch a lot of Cardinals games. And yes, with you, watched some Battlehawks games.
Mm-hmm. Do you think that St. Louis is a sports town?
Well, it definitely is. And it's always been a baseball town. I mean, some of the greatest baseball players to have ever played the game played in this town. Stan Musial, Red Shandy, Yogi Berra, Bob Gibson, Ozzie Smith, and then obviously we have more recent ones. So it's always been a sports town, if for no other reason than baseball. Obviously winning the Stanley Cup, clearly a sports town, being the world champions there. But yeah, I mean, it's had two football teams before the Battlehawks, so it's had three professional football teams: the St. Louis Cardinals, the St. Louis Football Cardinals that are now in Arizona, the St. Louis Rams that are unfortunately now in LA, and the Battlehawks.
What were your thoughts about Stan Kroenke saying St. Louis isn't a sports town, it's a baseball town? Do you
Than God, and apparently he wants twice as much money as God, and figured he could make more money in LA, and I'm sure that he can. Um, but he made his fortune largely in Missouri, and now took our professional football away. So yeah, as diplomatically as I can.
what were your thoughts on the departure of the Rams?
It sucks. I mean, it. They won the '99 Super Bowl here. Had a good year. I think it was 2001. We supported them. Lots of people that spent a ton of their money to have PSLs and to buy season tickets. We absolutely supported the team. So, yeah, it sucks. My thoughts were that we'll never have professional football in St. Louis ever again. I was wrong. We had the Battlehawks, which, hopefully the XFL could come back in some other iteration after we get through this pandemic. But my thought was we'll never have another professional football team in St. Louis again.
What were your thoughts on the Battlehawks bringing professional football back to St. Louis?
I was skeptical, as you know. I was skeptical at first that they could, get a big enough fan base, because I don't know how you really compete with the NFL. But you and I went to that first game, and thanks for encouraging me to go. You and I went to that first game, and I mean the energy in the dome was electric. We had nearly 30,000 fans, 29,000 and something fans.
Just
in the
selling
dome.
out the bottom bowl.
Yeah, filled up the bottom bowl, and it was awesome. I mean, like you knew that we were a football town when you saw XFL, which I've got to think a lot of folks were pretty skeptical about whether it could last, and of course maybe it can't since they've disbanded. But we had nearly 30,000 fans cheering on Tiamu, and the receiver Washington, I think was his name, and I mean you would have thought it was the St. Louis Rams in there. It was exciting. I won't say nearly as cool as the two AFC championships you and I have gone to in Kansas City, but for a league that had just started and a team that 8 weeks earlier were probably who knows what those guys were doing. They were stud athletes, and they put on a great product on the field, and there was a lot of energy. It was cool.
Yeah. What are some examples of how St. Louis is a sports town in your eyes?
Well, it largely goes back to the Cardinals, because I can remember going into the stadium, and it was Game 4, 2006. We're walking in with some Red Sox fans, and I asked, your mom and I were walking next to them, and I asked them, had they been treated well in St. Louis, and they said, absolutely. They said everybody has been so kind to them, and we're walking into the game where the Red Sox break the curse. I mean, the Red Sox hadn't won the World Series since they traded Babe Ruth to the Yankees, and the curse was broken in St. Louis. And then I think when we took you and Nick to Game 6 in 2011, and still love, my favorite picture of you and your little brother is you guys holding a sign out in the parking lot of Kilroy's that said Texas is toast in the same font that the Texas Rangers were. And then we watched that Game 6. I mean, if it had not been rained out on Wednesday night, we would have left probably at some point, because you guys had school the next day. So it was like divine intervention, or being blessed because we're in St. Louis, that Wednesday night they call the game and they play it on Thursday night. You guys didn't have school on Friday, so we stayed till the very end, and down to our last strike twice in that game, and to win that game. I can remember we stayed in the stadium, I think till like 12:30 at night. We were watching the after game festivities, and then drove home, and we were still just so excited that we had won Game 6, and we knew we were going to win Game 7, and we're getting off of Highway 44, and you guys are like, we're hungry, can we get some White Castle? So at 1:30 in the morning, we're getting White Castle for you guys. I mean, I guess your question was why it's a sports town. I think the fans make it a sports town, and the teams bring out the fans. The Cardinals put such a great product on the field. The Blues put such a great product on ice. And what's the name of our? We still don't know the name of our MSL team. I think they're going to put such a great product on the pitch that why wouldn't the fans come out and cheer them on? So I think it's chicken and egg, whether it's the fans that make the teams better or the teams that make the fans better. But either way, we love our teams, and our teams love our fans, and that's what makes this such a great sports town.
Thank you. Now that I presented my evidence and gave a few interviews, my closing points are that I believe that St. Louis is more than just a sports town, and that it is a great host to all the different teams that have played in St. Louis. In my opinion, football has been well respected in St. Louis, especially with the high-power high school football that takes over St. Louis in the fall because of the absence of pro football here. Badhawks provided some hope, as well as with the crazy loud fans that welcomed the team to St. Louis with very welcoming arms. Also, even when the Rams were in town, and they still had fans showing up whether they were good or bad. I think that the most prevalent example as to why football matters to St. Louis and how it proves that it is a sports town is the Battlehawks. They're very strong, welcome, and their fans and citizens of St. Louis were very welcome to them. Also, with professional football back in St. Louis, the vibe around the whole city changed, and something that made St. Louis revolve around football. And even the Battlehawks even beat out the Blues and Cardinals in streaming during one Saturday, where all three of which are playing. I understand that at the time it was the Cardinals playing in spring training, but it was a Blues regular season game that they still beat out and crushed. And to finish, you can't deny that sports mean a lot to St. Louis and the whole city. Changes with football here, whether it is high school or professional ball, it doesn't matter. St. Louis still stands with football.